Hello, and welcome to the first part of our next unit. This unit will be on mainly the progressive era, as well as looking at the accomplishments of President Theodore Roosevelt and other progressives in the country at the time. And let's begin with talking about kind of the scope of this era. So the progressive era spans roughly from 1900 to around 1910. This era was defined by reform, so people wanting to reform the government, reform society in any way they can. The reason is many Americans in all classes, lower, middle, even the political classes, so politicians even, are fed up with the industrial oligarchy that had sprung up in the United States, and this period sees action taken to curtail its power. And this also includes the political machines as well. So we see a lot of civil service reform, we see a lot of societal reform, a lot of laws being passed that limit the ability of business to grow, quote, too big, and combine to limit competition and attempt to make more money at the expense of the workers and the American public itself. Now, a little bit of backstory. So before Teddy Roosevelt was in office, we have McKinley. And McKinley was inaugurated for a second term on March 4th, 1901. He had elected Theodore Roosevelt as his vice president. And then later on, he was killed while meeting visitors to the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. He was greeting guests before he was going to give a speech. And a man named Leon Sizzlegotz, I'm probably saying that wrong, who was an anarchist, walked up to him, and while McKinley was extending his hand to shake hands with the man instead pulled out a gun and shot him twice in the chest. He later died, and Theodore Roosevelt became the president. When asked about it in a discussion, Theodore Roosevelt, when talking about the death of McKinley and his inauguration, said, "It is a dreadful thing to come into the presidency this way." So he's kind of saying that he's accepting the position as an honor to be accepting the position of the President of the United States, but he would rather not have gotten the office because someone died. He didn't want someone to have died for him to become the president. Interestingly, a little bit of backstory as well, Teddy Roosevelt himself, he had grown up with a lot of medical issues as a child, as you've seen by watching the biographics video before you see this one yesterday. He grew up with asthma, he needed glasses from an early age. However, despite his health conditions, he became an athlete. He did boxing, he did track and field, horse riding, shooting. He's also an avid outdoorsman. His parents actually sent him to a ranch, I believe, in Montana, to kind of get the fresh air, the open spaces, and he developed a love for the outdoors. He would hunt game in Africa and South America, go on, quote, nature hikes. And his nature hikes are quite interesting because what it meant when they went on a nature hike was that he would go out and they'd see a mountain, and they'd say, "All right, let's walk to the top of that mountain." And you had to walk straight there and straight back. So what that meant was, if you came across a tree, you could walk around the tree. But if you came to, say, a creek or a river, you had to walk through the river to get to where you were going. So he would be out and he'd be basically forging the wilderness and things like that. I once heard a story of a gentleman who was a new British ambassador to the United States, and he came to meet Teddy Roosevelt, and he had this bright new, clean white Navy uniform on that he had just gotten pressed from the tailor. And when he went to the White House to meet the president, he was about to go on one of these nature hikes. And he said, "Oh, come along, man, it'll be great." And so the guy, not wanting to look rude, said yes, because when Teddy Roosevelt asks you to go out on a nature hike with him, you go out on a nature hike with him. So he went, and he's walking through the wilderness. They're going through all the trees and forests and brush, and he's doing actually quite a good job of getting clean, of keeping himself clean. And then they get all the way back to the White House, and the path they were taking goes through the White House pond. Now, the White House pond back then was not the one you see now, where you got a fountain that's quite nice looking. This was kind of basically just a swamp-like area. So it's very dirty, very muddy. There's flies buzzing around, things like that. And so the guy goes, "Well, I got to do it." So they basically all tramp through this stagnant swamp to get to the White House, and this guy comes out all filthy, dirty, disgusting. His uniform is completely ruined. And Teddy Roosevelt was like, bully, man, bully, which that was his way of saying good. So he was patting him on the back and all happy about he decided to help him go through, and apparently they were great friends for the rest of their respective careers. Teddy Roosevelt also emphasized a term called the bully pulpit, and what that meant was that he said that a president should use their position of power and prestige to advocate for what is right. And he was flabbergasted at the reluctance of previous presidents and the Supreme Court to enforce antitrust legislation during the Gilded Age years. So when he says bully, it means great. That's another word for great. He's not saying he's bullying people. He's saying that when he says bully pulpit, it's like the great pulpit. So by being the president and by speaking about something, he is throwing the weight of the office of the presidency of the United States behind that thing. So he's giving credence and using his authority to influence government or politics or the way life is in the country. So he's saying that I have this great position of power with a lot of representation and a lot of prestige behind it, and so he's saying I need to lend this prestige to matters that I deem to be important or things that are important. I should use this prestige to talk about what is important in society and talk about enacting social change, which these previous presidents have not done. And I'm going to do it now because that is what I should be doing as the president. It is my responsibility. It is irresponsible to not be using this position to advocate for what is right and what needs to be changed. That is the duty of a president, or one of the duties of a president. So not long after Teddy gets inaugurated, we see him undergo his first test as the president. So the first kind of large issue that he had to deal with as president was the coal strike of 1902, which was located, the issue was mainly taking place in the eastern Pennsylvania coal fields. So like places like Scranton, areas like that. And the issue that was on the table was that the United Mine Workers were kind of against the Philadelphia and Reading Coal and Iron Company. And workers were very upset back then about low wages and unsafe working conditions in the mine. I can attest. I've actually been to as we've discussed previously in class, been to a coal mine in Scranton. I think it's Lackawanna Mine number 8 or 9. And it is very, very dangerous conditions working in a coal mine. A lot of ways to lose limbs and to be horrendously killed and maimed working in a coal mine, and it is, I can understand why they would be very angry about this. So kind of one of the big figures is a man named John Mitchell, who is the president of the United Mine Workers. His father actually died in an accident in the mine, which is, gives him some personal, I wouldn't say vendetta, but a personal reason to be involved in this, in keeping workers safe. The union had half of the union was immigrants from abroad who spoke over a dozen languages. So it's very diverse representation in the union. The strike wound up wearing on into October, which aroused a lot of public fears because think about October. So it's fall, starts to get cold. And the reason this was an issue was because many believe that the railroads would wind up shutting down from lack of fuel and be unable to supply coal to heat homes in the winter. So railroad shuts down because they don't have any coal because all the trains run on steam, and you need to burn coal to make steam. So no trains going anywhere. So not only does no coal get delivered to people's houses, so nobody's house is going to be warm for the winter. Nothing else is getting transferred either, so no goods are being transferred. Nothing is, the entire country during this time period ran on railroads. So the fact that they were threatened like this because of this coal strike meant that, the entire nation was in jeopardy due to this one little issue. And so Teddy Roosevelt decides that he has to step in to help the miners. And what he says is that no matter who owns the mines, nobody owns the miners. And I think that's very interesting because as we look in the Gilded Age, we see that a large number of coal mines, or not coal mines, but just businesses in general, we often see them treating workers like they owned them. So if you looked at when we talked about scrip, and we talked about company towns and the practices being used there, like Pullman and Homestead, a lot of the time, essentially, the workers are being treated like the company owned them. They're like, we own you, you work for us, but you basically, they dominate everybody's lives. And TR is kind of a breath of fresh air and saying, no, nobody owns the miners. They're independent, their own independent thing. So that's kind of a bit of a new philosophy, you could say, or a contrast or reaction to the way people are being treated over the past 30 years since the end of the Civil War. Teddy Roosevelt also said that the government will act as a intermediary in the labor negotiations between the miners and the company. The company originally refused to come to the table to negotiate or recognize the union, and so Teddy threatened to use the army to restore order, and that kind of brought the coal miners, or the coal mine company to the table to talk with the union to work out a deal. And he additionally, as a larger scope result of this, instituted something called the Anthracite Commission, which was a commission made up of half union representation and half coal mine representation. So half of the committee was staffed by coal miners, and the other half was staffed by the owners of mines. And basically, their job was to investigate and reform corporate practices in the nation's coal mines, not just in Pennsylvania, but in the entire country. This commission decided to reach a compromise. They said, okay, so unions are going to get a 10% wage increase and a 9-hour workday. And however, and the coal company said they refused to recognize the union, but they said they would appoint a board of 6 members, 3 from the union and 3 from the company, to settle labor disputes. And this marks the first time that the government has ever stepped in to moderate labor talks during a labor dispute, because previously it had just been kind of left up to the company privately and had not really had any government intervention unless things got violent, as we saw with Homestead, where the government had to send in, I think it was the state militia, to restore order between the Pinkertons and the union workers. Whereas now the government is actively taking a role in moderating these negotiations and making sure that they do not turn violent, because they're there, present, working together with the miners and the company to try to establish a peaceful sense of decorum and negotiations during their meetings. And kind of this fits into Teddy's larger philosophy in terms of something called the square deal. That was his philosophy. He said that all Americans need to get a square deal, and what that means is that all groups of people living and working in the United States should get fair treatment from the government. The government should not, and will not treat you differently because you're a miner or you're a business owner or you're an immigrant or whatever you may be. You are going to be treated the exact same as everybody else. You are not, in a weird way, you're not special in a way. Like you won't get special treatment just because you're a big business owner and you own a lot of mines or industries and you are very rich. That's not going to give you special treatment. Everybody will be treated the same way as American citizens. Roosevelt's next big case was something called the Northern Securities case, and what this involved the Northern Securities Company, which was a company that was made to hold a large part of the stocks of other companies. And this was set up by several different tycoons, one notably James J. Hill, who was the owner of the Great Northern Railroad, which kind of goes up northwest Seattle, Washington State, Montana, that general quarter of the country. It was also with the Rockefellers, Standard Oil, those guys. We've talked about them a lot with Gilded Age. J.P. Morgan, we've also talked about him with Gilded Age, the banker. Another man, E.H. Harriman, who was the owner of the Union Pacific Railroad, which is still around today. So a little bit of a modern connection for you there. This was meant to control. The whole point of Northern Securities was it was supposed to control the 4 big railroads in the Pacific Northwest. The railroads that were involved in this were the Great Northern Railroad, as we mentioned, the Northern Pacific Railroad, and the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad. And the reason that this was such a problem was because the Northern Securities Company disrupted trade by setting very high prices for transit in the region. And since this railroad is a critical resource, we see again the case of where, because the United States runs off of railroads, that's the only way to get things around efficiently, quickly, and in numbers that was necessary. By combining and setting these high prices, these railroads are basically shutting down transit to poor shippers and poor consumers, and also basically screwing people out of money. And so they're jacking up prices unnecessarily, and that's just not right. That's a problem. And so as a result of this, Teddy Roosevelt winds up suing the Northern Securities Company under the Sherman Antitrust Act. I find this kind of ironic today in the sense of how the whole point of this case was to prevent these railroads from merging, but today we have a railroad called BNSF, and historically what wound up happening was a number of railroads merged to create this one company which kind of rules that general region. And that those railroads were the Great Northern, the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, and also the Northern Pacific as well, which I find kind of funny how the government originally saying, no, you can't do that, but then later on they wind up merging out of the fact they were just bankrupt and poor and needed to consolidate. And what happened with this lawsuit is that we see J.P. Morgan, one of the gentlemen involved, went to Washington to negotiate, and during his conference, he said, and I find this quite interesting, he said to Teddy Roosevelt, he said, if we have done anything wrong, send your man, meaning the Attorney General, to my man, who is one of Morgan's lawyers, and they can fix it up. So kind of he's saying, like, just... he's kind of treating it as like a business deal where he's just like, oh, just send our two guys to talk and then we'll figure it out. It'll be fine. Like, he doesn't seem to really be that upset or doesn't really seem to care that much, you could say, about the fact that he's disrupting trade rather than the fact that he's just like, oh, this is a small issue. We can figure it out and be done with it. No, it's like, this is not a small issue because you're disrupting trade in an entire region of the country. So... and Teddy Roosevelt himself marked, he said, that is a most illuminating illustration of the Wall Street point of view. Mr. Morgan could not help regarding me as a big rival operator, who either intended to ruin all his interests, or else could be induced to come to an agreement to ruin none. So basically, he's kind of as surprised as I am in that sense of, he's saying, this guy's treating it like a business deal. What's going on? Because this is not a business deal. He thinks I'm some kind of company. He's treating the government like it's just another company, and that's not entirely right. He's like, that's not how it should really be, and that's not how I'm going to let it be, because he's like, this is kind of an interesting... He's like, this conversation shows a very interesting insight into how the Wall Street mind thinks, where they're thinking of not the government as a government that's their superior and they should listen to, rather they're thinking of the government as another company that is interfering with their business practices and competing with them. So in the sense of these monopolies are trying to limit competition, their only competition is the government, and they're seeing the government as another company that's competing with them for something. The conclusion of this case was that the Supreme Court voted 5-4 to charge the Northern Securities Company with the violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. And basically, as a result of this, the company is ordered to dissolve entirely and liquidate all its assets and no longer exist as this giant railroad monopoly. And additionally, after this victory, Teddy Roosevelt moved against other trusts, the beef trusts, as we talked about with Upton Sinclair, and as we're going to see with talking about his horrible conditions and working conditions in meatpacking industries, the oil trust, Standard Oil, who we've talked about at length, breaking up Standard Oil. We're going to take a look at that in a little second. And also the tobacco trust, so tobacco industry, limiting competition. And so here we see the kind of evolution of Standard Oil in this little chart. And in 1911, the Supreme Court decided that they had to be dissolved under the Sherman Antitrust Act. And what they did was they took Standard Oil and they divided it into 34 different companies. And the biggest ones that we wound up seeing, you could see it split up all different. They kind of kept the same name, but they changed it to be a different company. So you can see it says Standard Oil of Kentucky, Standard Oil of California, Standard Oil of New York, Standard Oil of New Jersey, Standard Oil of Indiana, Standard Oil Company, and the Ohio Oil Company. So they renamed all of these. Then you can see, interestingly, how over the years they wind up changing. And so then we see California turned to Chevron, and they wound up buying the Kentucky Standard Oil, and the New York one merged and became Mobil Gas, and the New Jersey one became Esso, and they acquired like somebody called Humble, and they renamed themselves to Exxon, and then the Indiana one turned to Amoco, and it looks like the Ohio one turned into Marathon, which I find and here's where I think we see some irony. So the original point was to, and this is a thing I mentioned with the BNSF Railroad a few minutes ago, is that they broke up all these companies, and then slowly over time, they start to reform. Because if you look, Chevron's Standard Oil buys the Kentucky Standard Oil in 1961, and they buy Texaco as well, and then Unocal, and then become Chevron. So that's one very large company now based on buying other companies. Additionally, we see that Mobil Gas becomes renamed just to Mobil, and then they emerge in 1999 with Exxon, who used to be Standard Oil of New Jersey. So those two merge to become ExxonMobil. So another large company being created. And then the Amoco Standard Oil of Indiana was bought by British Petroleum, and then they also, you see Standard Oil of Ohio being acquired by British Petroleum as well. So now BP, which is a British company, winds up being acquired. So now we have 4 large companies from one massive company that was nationwide. We now see 4 large companies, and it's granted, it's not as big as an issue as the Standard Oil because there are still other companies. It's not one company for the entire country. It is 4 large companies across kind of a large part of the country and the world, because BP is kind of global. They're all really global, but it's in a sense of, it's interesting how the government broke this very large company up into very much smaller companies, and over time they slowly started to reform and re-merge and make a large company again. Whether or not this might result in another very large Standard Oil-like company, I don't know. I find it unlikely. But I think it's an interesting little historical parallel you could look at. And speaking of parallels and kind of these interesting trends, Teddy Roosevelt he's got a reputation for being a trust buster. In that he'd look at the trust and he's like, there's a trust busted, break it up, you can't have that. Well, not exactly. He was one of the first trust busters. There's a decent argument, and we're going to get to look at that a little bit more with William Howard Taft. But Taft actually broke up more trusts than Teddy Roosevelt ever did. Taft was more of a trust buster than Teddy Roosevelt did it, because Roosevelt did it first. He was the guy who, was more well-known for. So anyway, Teddy Roosevelt decided that you need to differentiate between good trusts and bad trusts. And he said that we need to only use laws to break up the bad trusts. And bad trusts it's kind of like going back to our captain of industry versus robber barons argument from Gilded Age, is that bad trusts are the ones like the robber barons in that argument, the trusts that attempt to end competition through making kind of backhanded, underhanded, backroom deals, sneaky agreements. They're trying to actively hurt, then cooperate illegally to try to make profits and hurt the public. Good trusts, you say, only need to be regulated. We don't need to dissolve them entirely. We just need to regulate them, and that's fine. And he's like, these people, and this is kind of the way that we often look at Microsoft today. People look at a company like Microsoft and say that you could probably compare them to a good trust in the sense of they beat their rivals because of the use of legitimate business practices and competition. So setting lower prices, having a better product, having more efficient management, or a combination of all three. That was an argument that I think Bill Gates brought up when the government was getting a little bit angry at him because Microsoft was getting too big. He was like, well, this is the game of competition. He's like, so you're going to punish me for winning the game of competition in capitalism? And then they're like, kind of. So it's you got to be, it's an interesting argument, philosophical thing to look at. But because of this philosophy, Teddy Roosevelt founded the Department of Commerce and Labor, as well as something called the Bureau of Corporations, and the point of these was they were to oversee the business of trust busting. So they would be the ones to really bust the trusts and start that process rolling. And the idea was that these groups would judge which trusts were good and which were bad. So they'd be like, take a look at a company and be like, okay, you guys are fine. You're good. You're a good trust. But another guy, they look at the business practice, oh, no, this is a bad trust. We got to do something about this guy. And so then they would, start the proceedings to do something about that guy, whoever he may be. And this is going to bring an end to the lecture for today. Thank you for attending and listening. I do hope you enjoyed what I had to say and found it interesting. I'm going to post another one of these tomorrow, so be sure to keep an eye out for that, and I will see all of you guys in the next lecture. We're going to be talking about Teddy Roosevelt's second term, some more of his accomplishments, and we're going to kind of talk about the legislation that was brought up because of Teddy Roosevelt's ideas and his actions. And we're also going to talk a little bit about progressives and the actual progressives, not just Teddy Roosevelt, but the other groups that took similar types of actions in reforming society. And we're going to kind of end tomorrow right up with the Taft. So Taft is going to be where we get to tomorrow on the next video. So be ready for that, because Taft is going to be where we kind of pause tomorrow. But that's what we're going to be doing. So that you all have a nice rest of your day, and take care.